some of my ideas with you. So the topic today is virtuous disagreement possible? It's a kind of afterthought of a book that I wrote a few years ago called Disagreeing Virtuously. The subtitle was something like Religious Disagreement from Interdisciplinary Perspective. In fact, even though there's a word religion in the title, I do aim to address the question of disagreement more broadly, so that the theory that I present there could easily be adapted also to non-religious contexts. So I will be building on the work that I've done in that book, and I kind of try to undermine what I did in the book, because when the book came out, I think it was 2017, I felt that it was written for a different time. And we in the Western world had moved forward from the point from which I started to write it when I was in Princeton in 2011. So now I'm going to address this question. And I mentioned that my talk is about 25 minutes, and then, of course, I welcome any questions that you might have. So, in my previous works, especially in this book that I mentioned, I have defined virtuous tolerance as consisting of following elements. So that first, there has to be a genuine disagreement over an idea, action, or a goal. Second, there has to be the power to hinder the conduct of the other towards this same idea, action, or a goal. And third, there has to be deliberate refraining from hindering the other from reaching this idea, action, or a goal. And this is a kind of standard definition of tolerance that you find from standard textbooks. So these elements, 1 to 3, are typically used to define tolerance in general. However, I have suggested that additional elements are needed, and these include the 4 and 5. So maintaining a critical attitude and a public conversation, and 5, conversation and dialogue has to express intellectual virtues. And why these 4 and 5 are needed? Because without them, the tolerance will transform either into neglect or approval, both of which are attitudes that are unvirtuous in a case where genuine disagreement exists. So in my previous work, I have tried to amend the traditional understanding of tolerance. So in this talk, I will build upon this initial theory of virtuous tolerance, and I ask whether this is something that we can reasonably hope for. On this account of tolerance, requires the existence of genuine disagreement, and therefore I will be speaking here about specifically about virtuous disagreement. So thus, as stated, in order for the disagreement to remain virtuous, it needs to uphold its critical edge. While satisfying the demands of virtue theory, virtuous disagreement creates additional problems, which include pragmatic considerations such as who would want to remain in such an intermediate state. And moreover, is this too high a demand for humans? Ethical considerations include charges of possible abuse or harm. Some disagreements, if prolonged over a long period of time, may harm one of the parties more than the other, and some may wish to keep this state going without it ever reaching resolution if it benefits them. I, however, think that the benefits of virtuous disagreement are greater than its disadvantages, and it should be held as a gold standard in human interaction. However, I remain unsure whether this is possible in practice, because humans are not generally virtuous in these kinds of matters. But let us first say something about the instantiations of disagreement, which somehow prevent or make it difficult for us to enter into proper environment of a beneficial disagreement. In his book on human flourishing, sociologist Christian Smith offers a 6-stage account of how things can go wrong in human life. And I use and modify his account to illustrate how disagreements and dissent may cause harm in our lives. So the first source of harmful disagreement is simple ignorance. So we just simply lack the knowledge that we should have. Secondly, people may be untrained in the right kind of epistemic behavior, so that they might have the knowledge, but they don't know what to do with it. And a failure to follow the training consistently over time and pursue the good means that one is undisciplined. So the person may lack certain intellectual virtues to engage the topic and the evidence in a proper manner. And if one willingly avoids virtuous action and seeks to enhance morally subpar practice, the behavior can be called epistemologically pathological. There are also cases when the persons would like to act better, but is unable to do so. This option may manifest when someone is a tragic victim of fate. This means that one is blocked from knowledge and beneficial interaction by some states of affairs which are outside one's own control. Also, when the person is a victim of institutional injustice, his or her access to improved cognition and action is thwarted in purpose. These states of affairs block the road to sustained and virtuous forms of disagreement. It's possible to argue that at least some of these harmful options can be avoided by using reason and other cognitive skills in a right way in a proper context. This does not help in situations when the entry to this context is blocked from us by an outside force, which is not under our direct influence. But I leave those issues aside here. A central feature of Smith's account is personal freedom and responsibility. Even if we cannot rule over all of the aspects in our lives, we still have significant wiggle room when it comes to how we choose to interact with the world. This obviously gives us the freedom to go down the spiral or strive towards greater flourishing. If we turn towards the elements that could help to foster an environment that could enable beneficial disagreement, Christian Smith offers the following list. First, or number 1, physical survival, security, and pleasure. 2, knowledge of reality. 3, identity, coherence, and affirmation. 4, exercising purposive agency. 5, moral affirmation. 6, social belonging and love. So these 6 features or requirements are, according to Smith, essential for human flourishing. And also I use Smith's ideas to argue that these are some kind of requirements for virtuous disagreement as well. So it seems to be quite obvious that these features are necessary for successful reasoning and management of disagreement or dissent. I will comment on them briefly. So if we are under a threat or we experience displeasure, we are not well placed to engage in a fruitful conversation. Having a high number of true beliefs about the world is a natural prerequisite to any meaningful engagement with anything outside our heads. Part of our sense of security is linked to how we experience other people in relation to ourselves. And we do not like that we are being criticized for holding certain views, some of which may be essential to our identity and some of which form the basis of our moral agency. That is to say, I do not merely do some random things, but I do certain things which I perceive as morally good or even mandatory. We enhance the sense of unity of the self by hanging out with people who validate our view of the world, and our cliques or bubbles are there to support us and help us to flourish. Now, this all sounds fine, but there's also a problem which touches especially the last 4 items in Smith's list. It's entirely possible, and in fact not only common but perhaps necessary, that I have at least some false beliefs about these items. Our identities consist of vast number of beliefs, some of which are metaphysical, moral, religious, political, or ideological. These beliefs ground our identities and actions, and they also function as gatekeepers by which we sort out our social connections, that is to say, who's in and who's out. To drive the point home, we could think about a supporter of a National Socialist Party in Germany in 1930s. We can safely assume that an average Nazi wished that their identity was not only validated, but also celebrated by the others. They believed that they were engaging in purposeful moral agency in making Germany rise from the humiliation of Versailles Treaty. They believed that their cause was just and moral, and the party offered mutual support, sense of belonging, and love. Now, mutatis mutandis, the same can be said of communists or contemporary American Democrats and Republicans, contemporary Russians, Ukrainians, or any one of us. My intention, however, is not to claim that, for example, American Democrats are morally comparable to Nazis, because they are not. Instead, I intend to say that our first-person perspective to our deepest beliefs is always similar. We think that we are correct and the others are just wrong, and that this should be obvious to everyone, which it is not. Sociologist Peter Perger calls this the inversion of this heretical imperative, which means that we are always heretics from the viewpoint of a vast number of people, but it's painful for us to acknowledge this. Our natural reaction to this is to find ways of validating our orthodox beliefs in contrast to the real heretics' accusations. This happens by downgrading the epistemic credentials of the others, either by tagging them as unintentionally ignorant or intentionally evil. This brings us to the following paradox. In order to be able to disagree with someone virtuously, I need to be safe. But in order to genuinely disagree, I need to realize that my most cherished beliefs that ground my identity are under a threat. Thus, I must be safe in order to engage someone in fruitful manner, but this simultaneously requires me to enter a space that is not safe. So let us call this the paradox of virtuous disagreement. There are 3 natural or easy ways to solve this paradox, all of which fail the requirements of virtuous tolerance and virtuous disagreement. So first one I call no threats. The most common reaction is to adopt a stance according to which the other does not really pose an epistemic threat. We can engage in the debate safely because we already know that the other is wrong. Effectively, this turns the disagreement into a play or a show. In this case, we implicitly downgrade the epistemic credentials of the other, and we engage in the debate only to bolster our sense of epistemic superiority. The second case is called no safety. So a less obvious yet a common reaction is that we acknowledge that the other does in fact pose a non-epistemic threat, so that we lose our sense of safety. But because of this, the other does not pose us a genuine epistemic threat, because the threat is non-epistemic. We reason that because the other has to resort to non-epistemic forms of persuasion, like threats or some forms of moral indignation or something along those lines. So this entails that he or she does not have any epistemic means at her disposal. Again, genuine disagreement is ruled out. The third option is called no truth. So here we teach close to some postmodern arguments, according to which we can reduce everything to power. The others hold their views merely because they have some special privilege that makes it easy for them to hold their beliefs, and they do not hold them because they have good reasons, despite possibly having some privileges. It would be foolish not to acknowledge that sometimes people hold beliefs merely because it's beneficial and easy for them to hold those particular beliefs. But if we approve the reductive argument in totality, we give up our rights to argue for our case, because then also our beliefs would be supported not by reasons but by power. So we end up in some kind of quagmire. So virtuous disagreement requires rejecting these aforementioned three moves, so that we recognize that we are faced with a genuine epistemic challenge that is presented to us fairly, so that we see its real merits, which challenge our own position. Of course, this does not rule out the existence of aesthetic disagreements, but we are not interested of those here. I have already hinted in the beginning that finding ourselves from such a virtuous position is rare, yet it is not impossible. But where is this possible world exactly? In response, I suggest 4 solutions. First, virtuous disagreement applies only to particular types of disagreement. Virtuous disagreement can be exercised only in particular environments. C, virtuous disagreement can be manifested only between extraordinarily virtuous people. And D, virtuous disagreement is an ideal which cannot be manifested perfectly, but which must nonetheless be pursued. And let us consider each of these in turn. So is virtuous disagreement a luxury that can be enjoyed only when the topic of disagreement does not really matter? If we disagree about things like which is better, chocolate or vanilla, we can happily agree to disagree. Also, there are cases when we can expect that we have an access to reliable evidence that will settle the matter soon, and that enables us to disagree virtuously. But I would consider these as easy or low stakes cases for virtuous disagreement. But there are cases where the stakes are higher. For example, when we have temporal or moral urgency, we may be obliged or forced to act and forego the negotiation between disagreeing parties. In deep existential matters and in the world of politics, we are often forced to act based on limited knowledge. And we do not have absolute knowledge of these matters, but we just need to do something. So how should we view such cases? In these hard and high-stakes cases, it would be wise to acknowledge that we are in such a situation. However, this seems to be counterintuitive for us. Instead, in these kind of situations, we are prone to overstate our case because we realize the precarious nature of the situation we are in, and we need to ensure that our own ranks do not break. Thus, we easily demonize the opponent and view the evidence supporting our case into optimistic light. If someone tries to propose a mitigation, he or she is easily viewed as a traitor. So it is hard to disagree virtuously in high-stakes cases, but some people are able to do this. Then on B, I already noted that the no-threat situations are a form of play. However, this is not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes we can imagine an alternate state of affairs or the possibility of us being wrong. Granted, this is not always easy, and often we actively object to entering such imaginations. We already have such cultural spaces and practices for imaginative disagreement, however. For example, medieval court system developed the notion of advocatus diaboli, or the devil's advocate, where someone was supposed to argue against the proposed view. Armies and corporations used the so-called 10th man rule, where if 9 persons or the supermajority of the persons agree, one is supposed to argue against their view in order to avoid group thinking. Debate clubs often require someone to defend a view they do not normally hold, and so on. Moreover, we could have forms of debates where none of the parties are not directly invested or even interested about the issues. As we speak, there is a very poor quality public debate going on about harvesting of forests in Finland. And I believe it could be beneficial, for example, in this case, to stage debates between complete outsiders who are not invested in this business, although it must be acknowledged that finding such people might be very hard. Then on C. So who are these extraordinarily virtuous people, and do they actually exist? In sociology of religion, it has for long been customary to distinguish between different religious orientations. The 3 main classes are called extrinsic, intrinsic, and guest orientations. So extrinsic religious orientation is occupied with the external benefits of belonging to a religious or ideological community, including things like personal advancement and comfort. Extrinsic orientation perceives religious life as a way of beneficial networking with only minimal or outward adherence to the actual teachings of a given religion. Sometimes this extrinsic orientation is also called civic religion. So this type of instrumental view of religiosity correlates more with the outgroup prejudice than intrinsic religious orientation, which shows less hostility towards outgroups and more internalized and conscious relationship to one's own creed. The third kind of orientations, these quest orientations, are characterized by less rigid grasp of religious beliefs. The religious orientation welcomes doubt and tentative attitudes, and it's generally more open to disagreement and cognitive dissonance. In Christian theology, those having quest orientation are often classified as mystics or saints, but it's also possible for normal people to hold this orientation. In secular context, we could have epistemic saints who are able to enter into conversations with a similar kind of attitude. So there are persons who possess high degree of self-awareness and self-transparency. They are certain enough of their own convictions so that they are not prone to denial and other psychological defenses which could harm their judgment. At the same time, they realize that their convictions are hardly perfect in every way, and there's always something more they could learn, even from people who hold opposing viewpoints. We know that there are people like this, even though there are not very many of them, and even all of them cannot necessarily sustain such a kind of mind consistently in every situation. Then notes on D. The paradox claims that achieving religious disagreement is anything but simple, and it's inherently unstable. Nonetheless, we recognize that this is, in many cases, a goal worthy of pursuing. Often we pursue goals that appear unrealistic, and we are praised for doing so, especially if we succeed in reaching such a goal. On the other hand, pursuing an unrealistic goal can be deemed vicious. A general who orders a charge that it's unlikely to achieve any goals and which sacrifices unnecessary troops and resources is not a praiseworthy general. So is virtuous disagreement a risk that is worth taking? Sometimes the benefits are more obvious and less risky. Some social epistemologists have suggested, for example, following things. For example, Catherine Dormandy argues that ideally virtuous disagreement exposes the prejudices and unsubstantiated convictions of both the individual and the group. It expands the evidential basis on which individuals and groups build their convictions. And it opens up alternative ways of thinking and looking at the world. And it reduces the prejudices different groups may have about each other. The risks concern mostly the possibility of our side showing weakness if we expose our convictions for open debate, and that the other side uses this weakness for their advantage. This risk is always real. Validating our point of view tastes often sweeter than having correct point of view. And we know that the others think like this too. Morally, the choice should be obvious. But because we are human, we often consider morality as an afterthought. This brings me to the conclusion. I think that the all four options presented here can be true simultaneously. We can recognize that virtuous disagreement is hard, but sometimes even acknowledging this may be helpful. When we know this, we can create societal spaces for virtuous disagreement, and let us call these spaces adventurous spaces, not safe spaces. We are also able to recognize people who are able to enter such spaces if we as individuals are not ourselves able to do so. And finally, we should actively pursue these kind of disagreements because they are societally beneficial. The problem, however, is that these practices are individually repugnant. Virtuous disagreement is thus possible in some limited sense, but is something that we do not like because it will not offer us the validation of our currently held convictions. Thank you.